Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special session of the Southeast Asia Development Symposium. My name is Teymoor Nabili. I am the publisher and the CEO of techforimpact.asia, which is an online knowledge and solutions hub for developing Asia. It's sponsored by the ADB, and our goal is to drive the adoption and the scaling of sustainable development solutions around the Asia-Pacific region by framing and presenting those solutions in what we think to be an easily accessible and storytelling format, which makes it easier for the regional entrepreneurs and investors and anyone who's interested to take those ideas and translate them into actual projects on the ground in specific contexts. And I say that because the basic approach of Tech for Impact is the basic approach we're bringing to this particular session. The session is called From Technology to Leadership, Putting the Transformation Back into Digital. And the thinking behind this title that we've given it is really, as I say, in the same thinking that went behind Tech for Impact. What we want to do is put the focus on action and on tactics rather than on broader big picture strategies. Because really, when all the studies are completed and the insights have been teased out and the findings have been published and the recommendations have been made from those big picture discussions, what we want to know is, what does it take to translate all those big ideas into action? And who has the agency to make things happen? What we want to consider on this panel is, what does the new normal actually involve in real life? And who is going to make it happen once we've finished doing all this talking? We're going to consider those questions from a very practical perspective with the help of my three panel guests today, all of whom are practitioners and business leaders who focus on innovation and transformation and leadership. And I'll be asking them to talk about their experiences and their observations about how we should be approaching the task of translating the concept of the new normal into the practical reality of driving transformations on the ground. Let me introduce you to those panelists. Virginia Tan is the founding partner of Teja Ventures. She is also very active in the gender-specific investment space all around Asia and China. So I'll let her tell you a little bit about that in a moment. Prasoon Kumar is the CEO of BillionBricks. Zahin Hussain is consultant at UNDP CoLabs. Just a quick top line. Let's let them introduce themselves and tell a little bit about what they do and what they think about this concept of the new normal. Virginia, let me begin with you, if I might. Please tell us a little bit more about Teja Ventures and all your other activities. And where are we going with the new normal?
Thank you, Teymoor. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I founded Teja Ventures, which is Asia's first gender lens venture capital fund. Essentially, what we fund are technologies and business models for the she economy. So technologies and business models which leverage upon women as a demographic, whether they're consumers, online traffic, a mobile workforce, etc. And I mean, this year, despite COVID, or I would say because of COVID, we've been actually incredibly busy. I think the amount of sort of new technologies and business models that we see, where women are actually conduits to new markets, are astounding. And I think one of the things that I've actually realized is that while women are conduits to new markets and new consumption patterns, they are also conduits to a lot of the social change that we need to see in a post-COVID world. And I'm really excited to share that with everybody today. I also founded She Loves Tech, a couple of years ago, which is now the world's largest startup competition for women in technology. And, very fittingly, I think, Teymoor, this year, we saw more than 3,000 applications across 30 countries, in 6 continents this year. And as we lead up to our finals in about less than a month, our topic is actually She Tech's Charge. You're talking about putting the leadership back into technology and putting the transformation back into digital. And what we're seeing is actually as women actually take the lead in the very unprecedented times we live, some of that, some very, very positive outcomes that we're seeing. So look to share more about that later.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about how you see the leadership aspect of making these transitional and digital transitions in the new normal, Virginia, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Let's move on to Prasoon. Prasoon, I mean, literally is the perfect person to talk about this subject of taking ideas from the drawing board to the real world, because Prasoon began his career as an architect and then has moved on to actually not just being an architect, but actually building things on the ground. Prasoon, please tell us a little BillionBricks.
Thank you, Teymoor, and looking forward to the discussion later on. My background's in architecture, as Teymoor mentioned. I worked in the commercial design industry for about 10 years, building mostly homes and condominiums and airports, like for people like you and I. And a lot of the inspiration was behind what Teymoor mentioned about having all this knowledge that we kind of gather in books about what needs to happen in the world, but it doesn't get translated. So in 2013, I quit my job and I founded BillionBricks as a nonprofit to say that can we address the housing crisis in the world in a way which has never been done before, for the simple fact that everything that we've done in the past hasn't worked. Today, there are about 1.8 billion people in the world who don't have access to homes. That number will increase to about 3 billion by 2030, which means everything that we are doing today is failing us. So why do we continue to keep doing it the same way and keep talking about it, that this is the action that we need to take? So BillionBricks' goal was to innovate new solutions completely from scratch. And solution means all the way from hardware to software to business models and marketing strategies, and bring them on ground in the fastest possible time to create an impact. So in our first 5 years, about 5,300 people live in our shelters across the world. More than 10,000 have been impacted by our disaster relief work in various parts of the world too. But this year, we transformed ourselves from a non-profit to a for-profit on an idea which is about building the world's first solar home communities that self-finance themselves to enable some of the poorest of the poor get access to homes. So essentially the problem that it's trying to solve is of financing or housing finance, where the poor people are not credit worthy in most of the cases and are hence ineligible for housing. We build communities that have solar farms on them. The solar energy is then sold to generate additional revenue, which is used to offset the mortgage on behalf of the homeowners. By doing this mechanism, we think we can now reach to some of the very, very poor peak communities that typically are just not eligible for housing at all, but at the same time provide clean energy and make sure that the communities that we build are not carbon positive at all, and hence not negatively impacting the environment, considering climate change is a very real reality that we are facing. So we are very early stage in this new venture, which has kind of transformed from the nonprofit to the for-profit side. And there are a couple of prototypes which are operational in India and the Philippines, but we are now looking to build the world's first large-scale community with about 10 megawatt capacity, 500 homes in the Philippines. Looking forward to the rest of the discussion as well.
You're on mute, Teymoor. We're back on mute.
Apologies. The presenter should really be on top of this stuff, shouldn't they? Prasoon, just before we go on to Zahin, let me just ask you, within the context of this idea of the new normal and the post-COVID world, just give me a sense of whether your thinking has changed much and whether it really relates, these high-level concepts relate to the work that you do on the ground.
I think the idea of the new normal, I think, is a great one. I think, I mean, the kind of transformation that we've seen in just the shortest span of time, like compressed into the last 6 months in the society across the world is just mind-boggling, right? But my feeling is that I think this the sample size that we have right now with the changes and what the new normal will be is probably too small for us to start thinking that the world would be very different. I think we humans are quite forgetful, and then we kind of start to forget and move on with our lives. So I hope that this new normal actually remains new and we don't get back to doing the same things that we were making a mistake earlier on. Because at the end of the day, I think whether the change is sustainable or not would decide whether we've actually done a good job in the recovery that's about to happen. And I think the recovery is going to be very, very long, because I think this is also a change where some communities have benefited a lot and some have been impacted very negatively, and that negative news is not out there at this moment.
All right, thanks, Prasoon. And let's move on, last but not least, of course, to Zahin Hussain. Now, Zahin is with UN CoLabs, which is a collaboration between the UNDP and City Foundation. They support entrepreneurs and ecosystems in emerging markets. Zahin, tell us a little bit more about your work and how you relate to this particular area of the subject.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Teymoor, for the introduction, and really great to be here with Prasoon and Virginia. Just on a note, actually, Virginia, I just ran a workshop for She Loves Tech Bangladesh last week, so it's really amazing to know that you were a founder of that movement. So I'm really excited to be here. So I'll share a little bit about my work with the UNDP CoLab program, Youth CoLab program, as well as sort of what has been my interest in this space, working with young people, developing leadership, working with social enterprises, startups, and inspiring, I think, overarchingly what we would call social innovation. So for just starting with the Youth CoLab initiative, it was co-created in 2017 by the UNDP and the City Foundation to establish a common agenda for countries in the Asia Pacific region to empower and invest in youth in order to accelerate the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. And I think when we're talking about working with young people, we're talking about working with social enterprises and startups, what we're really referring to is a hub of energy and resources and talent and ideas that need directionality that can disrupt as well as be channeled into productive uses for the growth of our economies and social development, and also protecting the environment and addressing climate change. So a lot of the work that I've been doing with this program has really been looking at how do we enable startup ecosystems in emerging markets. So startups, I think, right now I'm based in Toronto and in Canada, and startups are a big part of the new normal that we're looking at. Right? We have governments. We're looking at how do we create a facilitating environment for these innovative business models that don't traditionally have access to the resources, the financing, the social networks, and developing a company is a challenge at any time, but particularly now with COVID. What is starting a business going to look like? How can we help these new business owners thrive? And so the work that we're doing in across 25 countries now is specifically focusing on more young entrepreneurs, those who are at not only just the early stages of their businesses, but also at the early stages of their careers, and have chosen entrepreneurship as a pathway to develop themselves into young professionals. And so what kind of led me here is I prior to my work at the UNDP, I was actually working at a university in South Korea, where I led and managed a social impact focused incubator. And the role of the incubator was really asking, how do we inspire young people to pursue innovation and entrepreneurship in a way that it is meaningful to service their communities, for the global community at large, and as well as address climate change. And so I think what I hope we can discuss in the panel a little bit more today is really what is the role of understanding the needs of various groups across the markets that we are working in. Prasoon mentioned a lot about sort of those who wouldn't traditionally have access to these homes. Virginia, somebody mentioned that technology was initially built for the 2 billion. And I think where I'm very excited for this conversation is how do we essentially lift all boats, right? How do we create that tide that lifts all boats? So that's me. Over back to you.
I'm also intrigued by the idea of how do we meet the needs of the market, because in any kind of business, whether it be tech or otherwise, or digital or otherwise, the question of, are we building it for its own sake, or are we building it to fulfill a purpose is always an interesting one. But Zahin, let me specifically ask you, with relevance to what you just said to Virginia. You just run a Teja, a She Loves Tech workshop, and in your context, within the communities and the entrepreneurship and the young people that you work with, tell me about the gender roles, the gender specifics, that you're seeing now amongst your communities? Are we seeing greater involvement of women? Are we seeing a greater empowerment of women? Just give me your experience of the gender aspect.
Yeah, I think that's really a really great question to start off. I think this is a space that I'm starting to pay a lot more attention to in order to understand the nuances of why does this gender gap exist? And I think it is twofold. I think traditionally it has been a lack of institutional support. There may be, implicit biases that were shaping choice architecture in terms of who got funded, who was, who was present at the table. I think that thanks to work such as She Loves Tech, we're having more conversations about creating the space for women to thrive, right? And I think gender lens investing and gender lens sort of focused development work has become more prominent in the discussions, in the way that projects are designed and executed and businesses are built. Now, one of the challenges that I'm personally, I've come across with working specifically with women founders is the self-limiting beliefs, right? And there's a lot of great research on this at this point, where you might have, a group of male founders who will come to you without a prototype. They have an idea, they'll evaluate the market for $40 billion. They'll tell you that they're going to be the next unicorn, and they're just so confident when they come in and they pitch. And then you'll get the women founder who already has a product in the market, who's already, revenue positive and maybe even reaching her break-even point. She's a little bit more conservative about her market size. But then when, she'll say something like, I know it's not that big, but, we're working hard to scale. And it's very admirable, when you see these women founders with that's humility to develop their businesses and make these real impacts. But it is interesting, I think, working between the dynamics of trying to coach and lead sort of male founders versus women founders. So I think, to really answer that question of, how are things changing, or, where's the gender lens? I think that there's two-part, right? I think we're creating spaces. And I think that as women founders and entrepreneurs, hopefully they're able to claim those spaces that are now starting to flourish.
Self-limiting beliefs are not, I'll tell you from experience, they're not restricted to women, but I'm perfectly willing to accept that the women are slightly less boastful and perhaps a little bit more suffering of that. I'll get Virginia to go into that in just a second. Before we kick into a really engaging conversation here and get our panel to talk to each other, let me just, I'm not sure how many people there are in the audience, folks. I don't have access to that information, and I'm sure there are people still coming in from their lunch break. But let me remind you, please, if you're out there and you're listening and you want to engage with the panel and with the conversation, just hit the Q&A button. I'll get the questions on the screen, and we can engage them and bring them into the panel straight away. I mean, I'm not going to wait until the end. If I see a decent question, I'll bring it in to the situation in which we find ourselves. But in the meantime, let's carry on with the conversation. And Virginia, let me get you to sort of address some of those issues. I can see you waiting.
No. I'm glad that Zahin actually brought that up. So, my work, I think my work in Teja and She Loves Tech is actually trying to address different sides of that same issue. So when we built She Loves Tech, we were 6 years ago. It was one event with about 100 people. We never thought we'd one day be, in 30 countries across the world, right? So I'm very happy that Zahin said, a movement. I don't think we knew we were building one. I think the first thing, you can't solve 100% of the world's problems with 50% of the world's population. So I think that's the first thing, just on a pure mathematical probability. The second thing we realized, and this is actually also where She Loves Tech is moving towards, if you have a great idea and a great business, but you actually don't have or can't raise the capital to scale it, your outreach becomes limited. And your impact is limited. So can you imagine we found someone who found a cure for cancer, but actually never actually got the funding to really scale it. So we all are deprived of actually that benefit. So I think, the one thing that She Loves Tech is going to be doing going forwards, apart from, having a startup competition and a platform across all of these, countries, is actually to really be just dedicated to solving that gap. I believe that the funding gap is the single biggest thing which holds women founders back. Part of that is self-limiting beliefs, absolutely, Zahin. But a lot of that as well is, I think that there is a huge chasm and a huge gap between the way entrepreneurs think and investors, male and female entrepreneurs and investors, but I think in particular female investors, female entrepreneurs with investors in general. I think a lot of those expectations are not aligned, and there's a lot of work to be done there. And so that's what She Loves Tech is going to be focusing on. Now, very interesting. So we move on to Teja. Teja invests in both male and female entrepreneurs, actually. And I think, I built Teja because, I really felt that we needed to see, if you want to talk about women, not just as entrepreneurs, we invest in male and female entrepreneurs, but women as conduits of change. So, what happens when you invest in a company or a technology or a business model, which then can empower millions of people, and in this case, millions of women. When we look at investing into a company, we're looking at actually what is the sort of the impact on women in the ecosystem as a whole, right? Whether it's as a supply chain, whether it's as a mobile workforce, whether it's a consumer, and this is actually very interesting. I want to share a statistic. Women do not control 50% of global consumption. Women control 80% of global consumption. And so when you think of technology, I really strongly believe actually in technology as a huge multiplier of impact, and women as users of that technology are as conduits, provided that you actually build that technology for them and around them. So I think maybe two quick examples of such technologies, right, which can empower women as a whole. And a lot of them, I'm very proud to say that Teja works very closely with Asian Development Bank's venture arm. And we actually look at investments together as well. So for example, recently we invested in a social commerce company in Indonesia called Shoks Rumahan. And actually the last couple of days, I was sitting down with the founder and actually saying, okay, so you empower, housewives, they are essentially your sellers, you sell them catalogs of goods, and they utilize their savings, their savings groups with women to actually buy these goods. And I said, please don't just build the technology. Make sure that whatever technology you build fits, what these women in these savings groups actually want on the ground. Don't just build, technology for the sake of technology. Build something that they can actually use and that they want. And he was like, yeah, I got it. A company that Asian Development Bank's venture arm and us, we actually have invested in is, for example, a company which actually does cashless aid distribution, just given how relevant, that has been, for example, in COVID times, and the company has grown 30 times this year alone. And actually, what I found very interesting with the gender angle here is that beneficiaries of aid can be male or female, but when you disperse, aid in a cashless way, the net effect, what we're realizing is that actually women beneficiaries benefit because, you're only allowed to really redeem, some of this aid in for food. You can buy, for example, you can buy cigarettes, you can buy alcohol. So, I think Teymoor, there's a lot to be talked about, transformation and digitalization and how that digitalization actually, can transform the lives of millions, going beyond just the role of women, as an entrepreneur.
Well, look, let me, and Prasoon, I don't want to put you on the spot here because, these can be politically and culturally sensitive ideas, but, it would be interesting to know from your perspective what your view is. I mean, Virginia focuses very specifically on looking at the role of women and trying to empower them. I'm sure that your particular business model doesn't have a gender aspect to it at all. I'm sure you're equal opportunity in all things, but just reflect a little bit on some of these issues if you could, and how they impact your thinking and your execution.
Yeah, I think, one, as you rightly said, I think, this is an area which is difficult to discuss, and but I think I wanted to make 3 points when I listen to Zahin and Virginia. One is, I think, my own experience, right? So when I ran BillionBricks as a nonprofit for all these years, and when we would go out to recruit people, 90% of our applicants will be women. The moment we shifted from a nonprofit to a for-profit, we have, I mean, I don't think I can recall any applicant who's been a woman, or maybe one out of all the applicants that we've looked since December we started hiring. Out of, I don't know, I've looked at 50, 60 applicants, just one I remember is a woman. So I see that there's a shift between our business, and our ideologies haven't changed, but we just don't have enough pool of women if you want to get involved. The second area within the recruitment side I also find is that most time when women apply for jobs, they're related to areas of, say, for example, marketing or operations, but not frontline, where we are involved in construction, execution, on-ground sales work as well. We just cannot find, and it's not that we are looking specifically for men or women. I mean, we just advertise, we market, but we cannot find them. When it comes to in the business side, a lot of advisors and a lot of people who kind of coach you, you find a lot more women doing that work. When we go and look for money and decisions on the money side, when we were in the nonprofit side, we would go to foundations and corporate foundations, mostly led by women, or at least in good position of power, as opposed to now as for-profit, when we go out, it's mostly led by men. So we see between the for-profit and non-profit, I can see and I can experience that as well, that there's a change, and I don't know what the reasons for it are, or we could speculate on some reasons, right? The second point I wanted to make was with regards to just the nature of the work that we are doing, right? So the fact that we are kind of at a combination of technology, which is very hardware focused, considering that we do homes and we do solar panels and we build these communities, and technologies on the backside. So when we go out there, and this I'm referring more to Zahin's comment on if a male founder would go with $1 billion idea as opposed to someone, a woman founder who would come with a much more mature idea may not get funded, is that we think that we struggle to get funded as well, because just software tech today has so much money investors out there. The risk on that piece is so less as opposed to what we are trying to do, where we may say it's very transformative, it could change the world, it has a huge positive impact, but at the end of the day, for investors, it's a huge amount of risk. So we feel the same way, that why is it that we are not doing something which is more conventional, simple, easy, go out there, build an app, build a marketplace, and start selling. And if you want to be in the social space, just weave a story around poor people and helping and empowering and do that. And the third and the last point I wanted to make is with regards to us being in the social sector, and I'm sure a lot of the audience in this conference would be, that I think it's become a tick mark for a lot of work that happens to make sure that women and women empowerment is something which is as part of the narrative. Even if it's not kind of ingrained, but these are some words that have to be spoken in this part of the world or in this area of work if you want to get your voice heard. At the end of the day, whether it matters on ground or it's materialistic or it's not important or not is secondary, but you have to get them involved. And it adds, in my opinion, if it's not core to the business, then it adds a level of burden in the business, and burden not in a bad way, but in the right way, where you are having to stretch yourself to do certain things which actually slow down your work and creates actually a lesser impact just because you have to get the tick mark on. So I just wanted to make kind of three observations. I'm not an expert in this subject at all. But
no, but it's, I mean, what you've done in a way is highlight the issues that Virginia and Zahin have also brought up, is that, you know, we have this tremendous imbalance between the impact that women have when they do get involved and the actual level of involvement that women have. And that imbalance surely is an incredible inefficiency in the potential for driving action and potential for driving change. And it's also a nice sort of transition into the whole idea of leadership and how do we nurture leaders that can not just enabling environments that lead to positive change, but that can actually drive activity and redefine the new normal landscape. Zahin, I mean, I guess a lot of attention is going to be focused on people like you who do this at the level of the youngest generations of society. Just give me a little bit of your thoughts on some of what Zahin has, on what Prasoon has had to say, and how should we begin to frame this challenge?
So you mean in terms of the challenge with regards to the financing gap, or the gender elements? Which part of the challenge do you mean, Teymoor?
Well, let me ask you first, just to respond intuitively to what Prasoon had to say about how he perceives these things, and then we'll talk about the challenge of leadership in a second.
Sure. I think intuitively, the first thing that really came to mind for me was, number one, is the challenge around financing outside of software. I think when we're really talking about digital transformation, or using technology for transformative impact, I think that it's really, do we have diverse interests and diverse representatives with power and capital making investment decisions? And I think that a lot of the discussions on digital has definitely been on sort of the digital economy, that anywhere from, if we're talking about blockchain, if we're talking about IoT has a larger sort of hardware components to it, but we're talking about AI, blockchain, if we're talking about machine learning, some of the more, I'm using the buzzword terms right now, but really to just get the idea across of what is hot on what is, whenever we're talking digital transformation, we're talking about what kinds of companies we see the success stories on, right? And I think the challenge is twofold. Number one is with companies outside of software, they do require greater amount of investment traditionally, and also a longer horizon for exits, right? And this is where you have institutional investors have played in that space, which again, I'm just sort of when I'm talking about this, I'm also referencing between what is the norm in North America, in US and Canada, in comparison to my experience in Asia, right? So when we're thinking about clean energy financing, that may be that traditionally they're larger ticket items, even for organizations such as the ADB, and specifically, I think the ADB Ventures was set up in order to go for address a tier in the market that is more middle cap, right? Small and medium cap businesses that could potentially have exponential growth and impact. And I think we're talking about the difference between zebras and unicorns and Warhols. There's a lot of dynamic debate right now in the venture capital community around how do we make financing more accessible. And I think the Kauffman Foundation has released a few reports that I'd be happy to sort of share. I'll try to search for it and see if I can find the exact names. But there is a lot of research being done around how do we diversify the types of business models that venture capital is interested in funding. So that, I think, when those were my initial thoughts, just thinking about the challenges that Prasoon has faced with regards to having a business model that's trying to address the bottom of the pyramid, and saying, hey, we can figure out the model, but we need to at least be at a stage where we can have a meaningful discussion around how this business model could work, right?
All right. Well, let me interrupt you there, because I want to get into the specific issue of leadership. Like I said, Virginia has defined the impact that women have in the business world as being outsized relative to their presence in that world, and indeed relative to what men do. And I want to see if we can address what part leadership and leadership training and the philosophy of leadership will play in defining the new normal. Because if we have this capacity with digital technology and with the post-COVID world to define for ourselves a new normal, then we need to make sure that that includes not only from a moral and ethical perspective, includes the existence of women from a purely practical perspective. So I want to ask you guys, what is your vision of leadership? Because, right now, when we talk about leaders, there are any number of philosophical models, but mostly they're focused around male qualities. There's even this particular school of philosophy about what's called the great man notion of good leadership, and it focuses on these heroic traits of action and heroism. Tell me a little bit about what you think about leadership and how we can begin to define a new vision of that that will help us in the new normal. Prasoon, let me throw that at you.
I think at this point on, I think leadership is critical, right? I think one important thing to realize is that, especially I think on the issue of women getting involved as well, I think these are changes which take time, right? I mean, societies don't shift in a disruptive way overnight. And if we just look back from 50 years to now, we see quite a significant shift. What digital has done is, I think it has reduced the barrier to entry for a lot of people into areas where they traditionally could not get in. And that has created a more level playing field, and more levelized as we move forward, right? And as this becomes even more normal. And I think that's where we would see a cropping of both kinds of leaders, which is based on their gender. So I think the barrier to entry for women is going to go down significantly, and they will take advantage of their digital side and come forward and start developing stuff. And that's where the financing side would also react to it, right? I mean, people react when the market starts to react and they see an opportunity, right? And nobody wants to be the first mover. And I think a lot of the conversations is around some of the first guys who are going to get their hands burned in getting into that space. The second, I think, is also going to be on the side of the men as well, where they would start to see that, I mean, they don't have a choice. I mean, they have to change, and not just because they don't have a choice, but changing a mindset takes time, right? And these are things which are ingrained in how you grow up, in what societies you've kind of come from. You may have moved to a more cosmopolitan area in a society like Singapore or other countries, but your roots may still be very different, right? And it's not easy to give up. So I think to expect, again, that everything would change or everything is being done in a negative way is not. But I think what is important are conversations like this, where there would be some group of leaders who will come and fight, who will be more progressive, and they're going to lead the rest of the crew forward.
Teymoor, could I weigh in on that?
Go ahead, Virginia.
I have, as you know, Teymoor, I love data. But when you asked me about what does leadership look like, so I think a couple of years ago, McKinsey did a huge study on leadership in a digital age, and I love this report. I literally read it inside and out. And they talked about the 9 defining leadership traits for a new age leader, and this is what they found. Okay, so they found that men and women they scored in 2 of the traits. Men scored better than women in 2 of the traits, and women scored better than men on 5 of the traits. So actually, what that paper was very interesting, and some of those traits included, role modeling, inspiring and rewarding your team, collective decision making versus individual decision making, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. But I use that data a lot because I started to realize that.
So just to stop you here, what were the traits? I mean, just give us a few examples of what women were better at than men, and vice versa.
Yeah. I mentioned 3 of them. I said, for example,
I just want the comparison.
Yeah, I said building and rewarding teams. I said inspiration and role modeling, and I said collective decision making. Those were these 9 traits were seen as what was most crucial to the success of an organization that a leader needs to have. So I was very buoyed by this survey, and I loved what Prasoon said. I do think that digitalization accelerated by COVID is actually going to lower the barriers of entries to women. So for example, take the future of work, for example, right? Is working from home actually going to become a new norm? And that also means that we as men and women can, reprioritize the way we spend, balancing work and life. But the truth is that I still believe that aids women even more than men, because women are the ones who always had to balance, for example.
I like the way you brought up collective decision making, because that's a really interesting aspect. A lot of the frameworks for leadership, whether they be corporate frameworks or whether they be public sector frameworks or whether they just be philosophical frameworks, they tend to focus on leadership characteristics of the individual, don't they? The leader is always portrayed as being an individual. He, and it usually is a he, is energetic and energizing and decisive. You don't hear many people talking about leadership in terms of they're a listener or they're collaborative. All these elements that don't come into that conversation. Prasoon, what your thoughts on whether this McKinsey survey actually makes a difference, though, in how we go about training and elevating leaders to positions of responsibility?
Yeah, I think, this is a very interesting point, right? Like, and we know that there is, especially I think in corporate culture, there is a certain level of, I don't know what should I use as a word, but you need some level of aggression, right, to kind of move forward, right? And that, I think, again, goes back to my same point saying that change where the leaders' characteristics change would potentially take time as well, right? And I think leaders tend to balance between what's on the outside and what's on the inside, where all leaders at the end of the day need to be good listeners, they need to be good, they need to have empathy. But the question becomes, who are you listening to more and who are you empathizing with? Are you able to empathize with everyone, which includes your staff, your customer, your stakeholders, or you are maybe empathizing more with some one category or the other? Right, and I think the expectation that the leader can empathize and react to all that changes are happening around are quite phenomenal. Which ideally, I mean, the fact that a person is leader should be able to do that. But in reality, to transform with so many things going on, especially if you are a leader in a corporate environment, I think is humanly very, very tough. And if you look at examples of some great leaders, you would find that they'll always have some characteristics which are not to the perfect extent, right? And it's just because for humans to be able to balance all good characteristics is not possible. I mean, you can look at great leadership, which you see on posters of people like Steve Jobs and stuff, but you still know that when it came to how they worked, the kind of work culture they created was quite different, right? And we kind of seem to ignore it for all the positive or the more exciting stuff that has done, and we tend to kind of misalign it. And if he probably wouldn't have been as successful as he was, probably a lot of people would have criticized for that way of dealing with his staff and team as well, right? So it really depends as to what image you're projecting. And at the end of the day, I think success trumps everything. So if you are successful by listening and empathizing, I think that would become the norm. If you're successful by leading with aggression, I think that would continue to be the norm.
Zahin, your thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely have quite a bit on this front. So I actually started my career with a youth leadership not-for-profit. So it was an organization called Isaac, and it really believed that if we could develop the leadership potential of young people, we can reap the demographic dividend. In across any sort of domain. So whether you're a corporate leader, a government leader, a civil society leader, I think there are some commonalities in terms of the qualities of a leader. Now, when I was working in that space, I think something that I remember having a conversation about, is it possible for everyone to be a leader? How, and there were, I personally, I believe that everyone has the potential and the capabilities that they can nurture to be a leader. But I think that's not necessarily something that I found that a lot of people agreed with. And I think what I mean by everyone can be a leader, specifically when we're talking about the new normal, is if we imagine that the 20th century was kind of like the age of amalgamation, right? It was centralized structures. We learned how to cooperate across multiple countries, markets, industries. We set up many institutions, processes, etc. But what we see in the new normal essentially are loose structures. What we're seeing is, leadership being diffused and dispersed across populations, and people are not, even in small communities, in whether it's Indonesia, if we're talking even Mongolia or Korea, even in the smaller communities, that leadership that you can demonstrate in your community now has the potential to have rippling effects across the world. right? And that's exactly it. When Virginia started, with a small event for empowering young women to pursue their interests and their passions for a career in technology, that can have ripple effects, right? So when we're talking about leadership in the new normal, I guess the question that I would really ask is what is everyone's philosophy on defining what is a leader? And if it's simply a matter, if it's a position, if it's a managerial position that defines a leader, if it is on the responsibilities that are based on size of an organization or of a group of people, I think that definition of leadership is outdated. I think that we've come to a point where every individual must demonstrate self-leadership and leadership as a means to nurture communities and cross-cultivate this sense of community beyond their immediate environment.
Kind of interesting in the context of what you said in the earlier part of the conversation about when you talk to women and their own vision of what they do and their position and their abilities to make a difference, where they weren't really quite as self-confident as the men. Their ability to be leaders obviously has some sort of relevance to that mindset, that attitude, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think I think when we're talking about female leadership, or we're trying to create a more inclusive idea or image, mental model of what leadership is, I think it is realizing that leadership is not the story of the hero. And this is a little bit of an interesting story, but for myself, I did work in frontline sales, and that was how I started my career. I did sales, and I learned how to, show up in front of a group of strangers and sell something and tell a story and create value. Now, the interesting thing about when I would go out, in Canada versus one of my first postings was in Vietnam, and one of my clients was a corporate client in FMCG, and I remember the client complaining to my boss that I was a bit too aggressive for a woman, and it's.
I'm sure a lot of people resonate with that story.
And a lot of times I've, especially having worked in Asian markets as a woman of color who is young and oftentimes in spaces that are dominated by powerful men. I've definitely had to I would say that I've had to question what leadership means, because for me, it didn't mean showing up and being the smartest person in the room and showing how it was actually about learning how to be agreeable and understanding that I need to, how to, and this is where it comes down to tactics versus strategy, right?
Let me put a question that's come up from the audience on leadership, and then we'll make this the last question on leadership. But Valentina Bianchini asks, technology is not a magic wand that automatically gives access to women or more vulnerable groups. What are the strategies that executives and public sector managers can use to encourage inclusive leadership model? And that's open to anyone who care to address that.
Teymoor, maybe I can I can address that. And I've been thinking about what everybody's been saying. Prasoon said at the end of the day, success trumps everything, right? And so here I am at an intersection of diversity, technology, women. I built Teja for one reason only, which is to build the investment case for what investing in the she economy or women as a demographic actually looks like. If we are not successful, financially, I mean, we can talk about what impact that is later, right? If we're not successfully financially, if the business models don't work, if they are not scalable, then actually, then in many ways, this rhetoric actually doesn't work. So to answer that question from the audience, and I think, Teymoor, you talked a lot about what business models look like for the unbanked, for actually the next billion. I really want to get back to that, actually, because that's the meat, that what does leadership look like? Leadership looks like taking a risk on these new models. Leadership means, as an investor, for example, understanding that, today I had a really interesting email sent to me by an investor of mine saying leadership means that maybe you're not looking for unicorns, but you're looking for camels. That's what the article actually said. Camels, because camels they live a long time in the desert. They don't drink a lot of water. They don't have to raise 100 million every year to survive. And so to the audience question about how can people encourage technology to be more inclusive, my answer to them is, I don't necessarily, I think that, for example, we see the Indonesian government, for example, banning single-use plastic. That's a great, clear indicator. But what I've seen as a result of the Indonesian government, for example, banning plastic, is that new sorts of, FMCG models are occurring. We just invested in a company which does refillable FMCG. So FMCG in mobile refill stations means that you're 30% cheaper and you don't use any plastic. 2-3 years ago, that was seen as a CSR, a socially good thing. Now, because the banning of plastic is becoming very real, that is now seen as something all the big FMCGs are going to chase because they want to expand market share. My answer to you is that it needs to work economically. I built Teja to show that these models can work economically. Where leadership comes in as an investor is that you have to take a risk. You have to be able to take a risk and do things differently and say, I'm going to invest in this. It hasn't been done before, and I'm going to support that entrepreneur. I'm going to coach the leader. These leaders, they exist. It's not like all these leaders, they don't exist.
Yeah.
Whether they're women or they're innovators, they exist. The question is, do you find them? Do you believe them? Do you back them? Not just with your words, but with your money? And do you stick with them when times are bad? That to me is what leadership looks like. And, yeah.
So
if I can just add in a thing about, I think the point about technology is at the end of the day, it's just a tool. Right. And we're talking about developing innovative, sustainable business models and addressing new markets. It's about the people who use the technology towards a purpose. Right. So the inclusivity of technology really just comes down to the values of the leadership and the purpose that they're trying to serve.
All right. Well, I'm glad you said technology there, because I want to pivot into talking a little bit more about tech, because so much of what we're talking about in this whole SEADS conference and in general life does begin to run tech. Before we do that, let me just remind others in the audience, thank you, Valentina, for your question on leadership. Anybody else in the audience wants to ask her a question, there is a Q&A button on the right-hand side of your frame, I believe. Please do contribute to the conversation. And let me get into a little bit of technology. And this is open to all three of you to sort of maybe address this. I've got a fairly broad philosophical question about technology, and that is, are we in danger of fetishizing the whole idea of technology? Because so much of our conversation does revolve around the notion that tech is going to save us and tech is leading us into this brave new world. And it seems to me that we're spending an awful lot of time focusing on everything that tech brings with it. Apps, functionality, digitalism, and to a large extent, profits, unicorns, growth, scaling, glamour, glory. And we're turning our attention away from the really basic stuff of building things and particularly in developing countries, building things that are practical and useful to general populations. So just as a general question to all of you, how important is tech in developing Asia in particular, and how important is tech in developing leadership, in developing all the gender equality ideas that we're talking about? To anybody who would like to put their hand up for that one.
Yeah, I can.
Go ahead.
I think just going specifically on the importance of technology in emerging Asia, I think that just goes back to the point that Prasoon raised with regards to lowering the barrier to entry, and the cost of doing business it has significantly reduced in the new normal. Right, we're looking at digital assets, newer economies of scale, new markets, reduced transaction costs, and what we're seeing then are entrepreneurs who can really think about innovative ways of taking new product solutions to market. So just an example of one of the companies under the Youth CoLab portfolio is it's an agricultural tech company in Bangladesh. And what they have realized is that, it is possible to really streamline agricultural operations. And what they've done is actually now create a new investable asset class for the middle middle class income people in Bangladesh. So whereas the stock markets and the equity markets may be underdeveloped in the country, what you can do with digital technology, with virtual assets, is you can actually provide a new way to generate wealth and create investment structures for people who would traditionally go unserved. So I think there's, and I'm sure Prasoon can share definitely from, BillionBricks specifically, but it's just technology is a great leveler in the playing field.
But Prasoon, I want to put the question to you, because, what Zahin is talking about there again is about technology, is about software, is about scalable technology and in a large extent consumer products and things that are easily made into profitable entities. Tell me about it from the perspective of someone who's actually trying to build actual hardware, infrastructure, things that are making a difference to people's lives. These things no longer seem particularly sexy to anybody. You've done a great job of bringing the two together, using sustainable modern technology to be able to develop those more traditional infrastructural components. Do you think that maybe the balance is getting a little bit out of kilter in this new normal?
Yeah, I think, since when you framed the question, you said this is a little bit on the philosophical side. And I think I would tend to agree. You see, I think what happens is when anything new comes in, so if the idea of technology comes in, and how do you make it acceptable, right? And hence a story is weaved around it. The technology will be transformative for the world. It will change, it will reduce the poverty, it will empower us. Technology will fight climate change. And that's how it kind of comes in. But the whole economic system today in the world is designed around growth, around consumerism, around consumption, and not around efficiency. So what technology allowed was to kind of fuel the growth in a very efficient way for a very few people, right? So if you look at the ratio of employees in a tech company to the ratio of what amount of money they are making, it's humongous, as opposed to a company like us or an FMCG company like Zahin was mentioning, where it employs a large number of people, but the profits per employee are much, much smaller. What that means is the distribution of wealth in an FMCG company is much greater, as opposed to in a tech company, which actually weaves a story that it's going to change the world. In reality, it changes the world for a very few people. And when we come to an organization like comes forward to say, okay, we are committed to solving a problem and we will solve it in the best and the most efficient way. If technology helps us achieve efficiency, which is in solar or construction, we will probably do it. If it doesn't help us achieve it, we'll probably not spend time and money on that particular thing. But we'll be true to solving the problem that we've come forward with us. But the issue really becomes is that for most entrepreneurs, its problem is, in fact, I think their real agenda is to actually build a business with least amount of resistance, as opposed to solving a problem. I think problem solving, if you are true to it, then it's very hard to solve a problem without any externalities. And that's where I think an organization like us is facing hurdles, where the barrier to entry for us is very, very hard. Where we've reached in 7 years since I started, I could do it only because I had one or two people who kind of championed and believed that they could do it. But in the large landscape of things, for people like us to succeed is very hard, because there aren't enough that pool of people. So in the new normal, I think it's going to get potentially harder for people like us to survive from an entrepreneurial standpoint, because I think people would go more for the digital, for low entries of barrier, and would potentially see a larger impact. And there would be some degree of impact, but I think majority of the impact would again go back to the very rich people who will benefit from this. And we can already see how some of the digital organizations are benefiting at this time, and where their share values actually sit today.
If I can just add in and clarify a little bit about the company and sort of the idea I was going for. The first is, I think when we're talking about, I think working in agri-tech, it's really about omni-channels, right? It's how do you integrate the online and offline? How do we take, the agri supply chain, which is very complex, involves many people, and actually make incremental tweaks in the way that the supply chain is managed, which then can allow for the aggregation of the value from that entire industry to then become a new asset class. So it's not technology, it's not software driven. It's more software as an enabler, right? And how do we get there? The second thing is, I think when we're talking about reaching, essentially when we talk about developing markets and empowering the bottom of the pyramid, we are fundamentally looking at, are they having greater access to wealth? And when we're talking about these digital assets and new classes for middle class investors to be able to hold, is we are really looking at new models of distributing wealth that were not, even if let's say it was possible, it was not attractive for the traditional financial intermediaries to get involved in. And so it's this blending of virtual and physical worlds that I think has a lot of potential.
Okay.
Yeah, and I just want to maybe comment on this thing. I think this is an important point and a great point, I think, on the discussion of the technology. I think we can't deny the potential that's out there, right? And I think the ideas on the technology side have now existed for 20 years at least. I'm seeing people in the agri-tech space or health tech space at the bottom of the pyramid. But I come from India, and I go back to India, I haven't seen the farmers in India having changed or their wealth having increased. There might be small pockets where something may have happened, but I see a lot more wealth amongst the billionaires and millionaires in India as opposed to on-ground change. So statistically, I see a lot of stuff online and in newspapers and stuff, but I spend so much time in rural areas and I haven't seen the change. And that's where I wonder, where is that transformative change and when will I actually see it?
Go ahead, Virginia.
Maybe I'm allowed to weigh in here. As a technology investor, I see both sides of the story. So the first thing which I loved about what Zahin said is that I think in developing Asia, I see two types of technology, right? So technology, which essentially replaces or in a sense makes up for the lack of physical infrastructure. Okay, so digital where there was no physical. And the second type of technology which I see, and I just saw a company in Bangladesh actually just raising almost $30 million today, leveraging on sort of existing physical infrastructure. So the company I saw was essentially it's software essentially for mom and pop merchants in Bangladesh to digitize all of their operations. So you have existing physical infrastructure, and then you add the digital layer on it, so you have that integration, right? And agriculture is another great example. So I think first and foremost, right? I don't see technology as solving all problems. For me, what I find technology interesting is as an instrument, as a platform, especially where there are huge inefficiencies of scale, or where access, was actually very, very expensive. So for example, let's take like a sector like mental health. Mental health, in a way, anybody who sought treatment for mental health, apart from like all the talk shows you see on TV, right, is like it's actually for for the wealthy, because who can afford to pay a doctor $300 an hour to go listen to you talk? So in places where there's huge either mismatch of demand and supply, or the fact that barriers to entry are very costly, then technology to me can be a tool. And then the second thing is, and this is to address, I think, what Prasoon said. It's like, I really do see that point, because then you're building this technology, everybody else benefits. So the person building the technology benefits, but how does that actually change stuff on the ground? Prasoon, this is where I see technology, especially where technology wasn't prevalent before, where I see technology starting to change things on the ground. And actually we're starting to measure some of that, right? So for example, if technology is creating remote work jobs that weren't there before, which allow people who are at home, for example, women, to work, then there is income increase. If, for example, technology is allowing farmers, which I'm seeing now, to get loans at cheaper prices than before, then when they didn't have loans before, that's great. If technology is allowing mom and pop merchants, we have quite a few companies like that, mom and pop merchant in just not in Bangladesh. If this is allowing them to save 10 to 20% of their cost. Saving 10 to 20% of their cost means 10 to 20% more income. That to me is actually sort of the impact. But the key, and as an investor, is to ensure that you put money into the model which we believe works. Sometimes if technology simply digitizes what was essentially unfair to begin with. So for example, let's take FMCG, because I spent all my time looking at this, right? FMCG for the mom and pop merchant or the sort of the seller right at the bottom is expensive because it goes through these huge layers of middlemen. And so every middleman sort of adds a layer. So if you just simply have a technology platform which digitizes the 10 layers of middlemen, instead of allowing them, the mom and pop store to go directly to the principal, then you're right. You're absolutely right, Prasoon. Like the end user doesn't actually change. But if the technology that you invested in cuts out all of the middlemen, but lets you go straight to the principal, then I would say, yes, actually that technology does make a big impact, without even changing the physical infrastructure, just leveraging upon the physical infrastructure. So the question is, as an investor, what do I pick? And that also means being very cognizant of what's actually on the ground, which is why one reason why I'm missing, the ability to travel during COVID. I realized that my understanding of the ground will actually make me a better investor. And I had, I worked in development before I became, before I went to finance, and those days are still very, very much with me.
Oh.
Yeah.
All right. Folks, I want to start bringing the conversation to a close and coming back to where we began and talking about how we can actually make real change happen rather than talking about frameworks for change. And so as we come to the end, I just want to remind anyone listening, if you do have questions, please do pop them in now and we'll put them to the panel. I do have one question from Vanessa Joy Lebron, who says, what key learnings can you share regarding the cascade of data-driven technology to the bottom of the pyramid who are uneducated and unable to grasp new technologies? Anyone volunteer for that one?
I disagree that the bottom of the pyramid aren't able to grasp technologies. But perhaps, if technologies were designed for the first 2 billion people, the wealthiest in the world, then you wouldn't necessarily expect, the bottom of the pyramid to adapt to the same type of technology. So I think, like, for example, there's a new operating system called Kai, right? For basically low-tech phones, essentially very cheap phones, right? Which is really, really, pretty hot these days, right? But obviously, the bottom of the pyramid may not necessarily take very well to iOS because, they may not have the data or the bandwidth to actually run those kinds of programs. So, essentially, again, it's actually about what technology are we designing, right? Are we applying design thinking when we think of technology? And I think in the past, venture capitalists have really only focused on the 2 billion. Like, for example, I think India is a very, very good example because for the longest time, I think Indian investors really will focus on the urban population of India, when actually the urban population of India is about 300 million and the rest are actually rural. And then now what I'm noticing, as of late, is that because of COVID, things which were seen, for rural populations, which were seen as very social impact driven before, are now suddenly becoming very, more commercial entities, more investable. They're being chased by investors. But
let me sort of reframe the question, Virginia. I'm sure that the idea not that those at the bottom of the pyramid are unable to grasp, but there is. I guess if we can reposition the question a little bit, or maybe Prasoon, you can address this. Is the technology available, and is the ability to learn it and use it available to those at the bottom of the pyramid? What key learnings can you share about getting the technology into the hands of the people at the bottom of the pyramid?
So I think in the regions where we work, we work in very remote areas in India, in Cambodia, Malaysia, Philippines. If technology is carrying a phone, which is enabled with Wi-Fi or data, I think the penetration is phenomenal. Does it get used for enabling people to get access to better services? I think is highly questionable, because when you get that device in your hand, you spend more time on YouTube than on any of the other services that are out there. So the benefits of pushing technology to kind of improve the quality of life and using that data and stuff, I think is secondary to the quality of content that gets pushed out on YouTube or the games that get pushed out. So the negative externality of that is probably higher, and it's quite shocking, especially when I travel around Philippines. Is just phenomenal. So I don't know how to overcome that in enabling the right content to reach to take advantage of the technology.
Zahin, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I would start with the fundamental question of what is technology, right? And I think that if we really want to get into the nitty-gritties of what is technology, it's essentially, I just Googled it, but it's just the application of scientific knowledge for practical purposes. That is the definition. And if we're talking about that, I mean, I think some of our most basic tools that we have is technology, right? Technology, they're tools. And so when we're talking about the first, I think what kind of technology is available to those at the bottom of the pyramid, are their ability to use this technology. I think we need to break down that monolithic idea of technology a little bit better. And I think technology is not just a matter of, it's not just a cultural import into a community. There is a lot of technology that is grown organically within communities and is used by the community to thrive in their livelihoods. And I think those need to be recognized as methods for creating change within those spaces. And so I think just building on what Virginia said is understanding what is the technology ecosystem or behavior system that exists. And when we're introducing new technology into that space, are we doing that with human-centered design principles at the core of the application, right? And so the way that I think it's just really comes down to, I think a lot of the assumptions I find just being in the development space for a long time is the patronization that automatically comes about when we're talking about people who lack access to technology. But the fact is that they have it. And I think we all have habits, and when we want to introduce a new habit, we have to start with the first principle in the design of that habit and build from that small step and create incremental changes over time.
Yeah, Teymoor, I just want to give one example of what Zahin actually just illustrated. Okay, because I think this technology is becoming more prevalent, especially post-COVID world. So, what is ed tech? For example, ed tech, I think, is really reaching, a turning point in our region because of, COVID. Schools are shut. So if technology access means that every child needs to have an iPad and computer at home, then you're absolutely right. Then there will be millions, hundreds of millions of people who just not have that technology. But for example, there's a company we invested in earlier this year. They're called Diobi. They know that children around Southeast Asia, they do not have computers or necessarily all laptops. So what they designed, the content around was actually for schools, right? They knew schools would have a few laptops. And what essentially they designed the programming around was that the teacher, most teachers in Southeast Asia are not, for example, they're not trained to teach STEM themselves. So what they allowed the teacher to do was play a facilitative role in a physical or virtual environment, and for children to be able to share and actually and for the content to teach the kids, but the teacher to actually play a facilitative role. And this was actually built with exactly Southeast Asia in mind, because we knew that we didn't have enough qualified teachers to teach them. Second of all, children still like to potentially learn in a physical environment. And third of all, most of them would not necessarily have their own sort of tablets at home. So I think, again, technology to me is a very dynamic thing. And the question is, how do you, again, apply and design it with design thinking principles with the end user? And how, and actually the question really is how as venture capitalists, are we going to shift our attention from the 2 billion to the 5? That's it. Yeah.
So there's a comment here from Kalinga Senavaratne. I think, to a large extent, we've already talked about this, and she's just probably talking about how we're doing in terms of balancing technology versus practicality. And the comment is, technology may be able to get a doctor in the city to diagnose your medical problem, but if a local health center or medicines are not available, what use is the technology? Which I think is a fair point. Another question here from Valentina, who says is with UNDP Myanmar. Interesting topic and example shared by the panelists. My last question: if they were to advise governments in Southeast Asia about tech investments for better public service delivery, can you name the 3 best investments to make in this current COVID-19 context? I'll read that again if you if you didn't quite catch your panel, or anyone want to make a comment on that, what would you say are 3 best investments that public services that we can make for public service delivery?
I deal with a lot of public officials and governments and look at problems from different perspectives. I think it's a great question. And I think one is I would refrain from giving any advice to anyone for sure, because I don't think people want that. But if I was to really give the advice, I think the question for public officials and for, I think, people in those sectors, I think, is really to see how do you make the mechanism work? Because I think if we drill down a lot of the problems that we are talking about, education, agriculture, health, housing, energy, amongst the bottom of the pyramid, I think the real reason why we're talking about technology to come in and solve it, why they're not being solved, why people are in this condition is because of the failure of the system at that level. And that problem of the failure of the public system, the government institutions, the political class is not being addressed. And I think as human beings, we probably don't know how to address it. So we keep kind of building solutions on top of it and say, okay, why don't you work in this methodology? But in reality, the system is actually highly corrupt and inefficient.
Zahin, let me ask if you've got a thought on that. I mean, in terms of providing public services, which really does address what we're talking about here today, which is actually making a difference on the ground rather than just talking about theoretical frameworks of change. What sort of tech investments do you think make a difference to provision of public services in developing countries?
Right. I think so much of Prasoon, I would say, I don't think it's a question that requires advice in the sense that there is no one size fits all. I think that's something that we've really highlighted from the conversation. It really comes down to the context, right? I think depending on the context of that given market, of that specific country, the needs at this time for a very specific group of people or a priority segment, because again, it's difficult for governments with limited resources to implement a one size fits all solution for everybody. But what are the priorities in that market? And I guess the way that I would frame it is we can't use, we can't necessarily use, like addition for a multiplication for a division question, right? It's a long-winded way of going about it. So it's really understanding what is the problem, what is the question that you're addressing, and developing a solution according to the scope of the problem, rather than coming with an answer first and then trying to find a problem that it fits.
All right, let me finish off.
Teymour, sorry, may I just weigh in on that question? Yeah, because I do have a very specific answer for that question. I've seen 3 things that governments have done and have collaborated with technology startups during this period of COVID-19. I see them in 3 ways. If there were 3 things to invest in, I think the first thing is, obviously digital health systems, right? Anything which, for example, telemedicine has been huge, during this time, digital distribution of, for example, certain types of pharmaceutical, treatments and monitoring, right? Given that not everything can be done physically in a time like this. Obviously, with serious cases, you still need to go to the hospital, but I've seen great investment in sort of digital healthcare systems, to bring down the cost and also the timing of real-time diagnosis. The second thing, if I was a government, is food and food security. What I've seen during this time is actually governments, for example, in our case, India and Indonesia, actually work with some of the startups we have, which are keeping supply chains open to either mom and pop merchants, to rural consumers, because at the end of the day, rich consumers are always going to find a way to be able to get food, but ensuring the supply chains are open, making sure that these supplies are still getting to them, but using private sector systems, I think is the second thing. And the third thing I would say is a tie between fintech and edtech. Fintech, because you always need access to money, be able to pay at a time like this, and edtech because, at a time when kids can't go to school. So those were the 4 things that I would encourage any government to actually invest in terms of technology.
All right, folks, it's been a great conversation, and we're getting to the end of our time. So let me ask one final wrap-up question to address the issue that we're talking about, which is making a difference. Virginia, you have used the word impact a number of times in today's conversation. And at the end of the day, the question is, how do we make an impact instead of just writing recommendations and theories on paper. How can we actually go about making an impact? And perhaps I'll throw the question to all of you and flip it around in a way and say, what are the biggest obstacles to impact? What are the biggest problems with actually going from theory to practice in making things happen in the context of everything that we've talked about? Zahin, let me begin with you.
Sure. I think I would say that we all start from a point where we have a theory, right? There's a problem that needs to be addressed, and we have a way of addressing this problem, but we're starting with a theory. And I would say what really I think moves us to the execution, the practical relevance of it is learning through feedback and iterating on that initial theory as we collect more information, as we bring more stakeholders to the table, as we understand more about the problem. I think it's important to create spaces where we're able to say what we initially believed is not exactly what we are dealing with, and we need to pivot. And I would say that when it comes to execution, and we're really talking about transformation, it's understanding that the solution can evolve, right? And understanding a problem takes time, and I think that we need to accelerate the time, that learning loop. We need to accelerate how fast we can learn, but nonetheless, understanding that it is very much a learning process.
It's interesting you bring in that idea of information, of learning, and I guess implicit within that is data that we get from performing the actions that we're performing. And data is so much spoken about in modern tech world, but data in the context of making an impact is a much harder and much more nebulous kind of area to consider, isn't it? There's that old management maxim, you can't manage what you can't measure. And the question is, if you can't measure something, then people are not really interested in actually doing anything with it or investing in it because they can't actually tell what the return is. So I wonder whether, we should be thinking more in terms of analytics for impact, because the world of metrics and measurement in how we measure impact and how we get the information that you're talking about there, Zahin, is a very fragmented one and not a particularly easy one to understand. So I just wonder whether the idea of having a better metrics and measurement system is something that the tech world needs to grapple with. Anyway, my 2 cents. Prasoon, let me come to you and your suggestions on this.
My focus is that we have to speak less and do more. If we know of a problem, I think to delve onto the problem and why it exists is not the place to spend time on, is to actually go out and do. That's the entrepreneurial thing. And then you learn on the ground, then you pivot and change. And I'm now 43 years old. I've heard of these stories of change for so many years now, for decades. And I don't see that happening. I only see conversations happening. This is how change needs to happen. We just go too light on institutions that have actually failed us, and action is very, very little. So I think let's talk less and do more.
Thank you. Virginia.
Yep. Love that. Action to us is putting your money where your mouth is. And when I think about investing in impact, one important shift that I'm really seeing now is that impact used to be seen as a CSR or ESG as a risk mitigation sort of strategy, right? And so I don't see impact as something which you do, and then after that you tick a box and you go, okay, then I created this amount of jobs, I created this and this and this, right? I think when I think about impact, I think impact shouldn't be ancillary, but actually central to the success of new business models. You're not successful because as a byproduct you save a lot of plastic. You are successful because you save a lot of plastic and therefore 30% cheaper, and which is why you are going to be the solution of the future. So impact is central, not ancillary, but the biggest resistance to that and the biggest challenge to that is about changing the way we think. But that also means challenging a lot of the way things are already done by a lot of vested interests.
What do you think about measuring the impact?
I think you're absolutely right. Teymoor, my team and I have been spending all of the summer actually building our own sort of impact methodology. But one of the things we've learned, right? I believe in doing, not talking. And I also think that we don't need super, I think adding very, very complicated impact metrics, doesn't necessarily help the system. You basically hinder the startup at a very young age. I think you need sensible, practical, reasonable impact metrics, increased income, how much plastic are you saving, what are the cost reductions, things which are important in terms of impact to ordinary people, not some lofty, framework. It's and case by case. If it's a mom and pop merchant, what matters to a mom and pop merchant is, can they sell more? Can they save more? This is give them more sales. If you're talking to base of the pyramid is, this is allow them to earn more, get better services, save more, as opposed to, so very practical metrics.
Fantastic. Well, listen, thank you all very much indeed for your contributions today. It's been a great conversation. Went longer than I anticipated, actually. And thanks to those people who are watching, and particularly those who contributed a question or two. It's been an interesting session, and I hope that we'll have more conversations around the issue of getting stuff done rather than just putting things on paper. So Zahin, Hussain, Virginia Tan, Prasoon, Kumar, thank you all very much indeed, and hope to talk to you all again soon.
Thank you very much, Teymoor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.